This is the 50th anniversary, almost to the day, in fact, of some very significant decisions that were made in Washington. The Kennedy administration, John F. Kennedy and his advisors basically decided in November 1961 to sharply escalate the war in South Vietnam, which had been going on for some time, and to essentially turn it into a U.S. invasion of South Vietnam. At that meeting, Kennedy authorized the U.S. Air Force to start bombing South Vietnam. Pretty soon they were apparently carrying out about a third of the missions under South Vietnamese markings, but didn't fool anybody except those who wanted to be fooled. Authorized napalm, and what we're discussing here authorized what ought to be called chemical warfare. Defoliation, it was called. The bombing then, as you all know, expanded, led to 500,000 American troops invading the South. The bombing, within a couple of years, by 1966, 67, the leading one of the leading specialists on Vietnam, the military historian, Vietnamese scholar Bernard Fall, in his last writings before he was killed in combat, wrote that he thought that Vietnam might not survive as a cultural and historical entity under the impact of the most severe bombing, a severe attack ever launched against an area that size. It went on, not only against South Vietnam and North Vietnam, at least where nobody was looking. The area around Hanoi was somewhat spared because there were a lot of eyes there, foreign embassies, but the southern part of North Vietnam was turned into a moonscape. South Vietnam itself may never recover. The bombing extended to northern Laos, which had nothing to do with the war in Vietnam. It was mainly because a lot of Air Force planes were idle during bombing pauses, had something to do. Here they virtually destroyed what amounted to a virtually Stone Age society, primitive society in northern Laos, littered with unexploded ordnance, people still dying, people that were literally living in caves for several years trying to survive. I interviewed a lot of them back around 1970. Then it expanded to Cambodia, which was actually the most intense bombing in history, following Henry Kissinger's immortal phrase, anything that flies against anything that moves. Those were the orders handed down by Kissinger from his boss to the Air Force, and the bombing, in a brief period, just a couple of years, we now know, reached the level of all Allied bombing in the Pacific region, the entire Pacific region, during World War II, including the 2 atom bombs, all on a remote poor peasant society. A lot of consequences to that, and very ugly ones, but it finally more or less ended. But it didn't end. As Fred pointed out, the effects of the chemical warfare continued and will continue. It soon very quickly turned into crop destruction, major war crimes. Fred can tell you a lot more about this than I can, so I won't go on with it. I'll just add one more word about it. There are serious consequences to not paying attention to what we've done in the past. One of them is just moral. If we're incapable of facing up to our own history, we're in trouble morally. A serious problem. But it's also quite practical, because if you don't face up to it, you continue doing it. And in fact, that's happening. People are dying right now from American chemical warfare. One of the many things I've done over the years is a number of visits to southern Colombia to isolated endangered peasant villages. Sometimes when I go down, it's too dangerous even to go into the countryside, so they bring people into the local town to give testimonies about what's happening to them. These are people who've been subjected to some of the worst terror anywhere. Colombia now has displaced, probably I think the second largest displaced persons population in the world, I think after Afghanistan. Millions of people driven off their lands. These are isolated, poor villages. Last time I went, about a year ago, driving with a truck given to us by the Ombudsman's office of the region, travels around almost impassable road. You go along the road, there's a tiny clearing on the side. Stop and go out. There's just a row of simple crosses. That's a place where not long before a bus had been stopped by paramilitaries who worked very closely with the military, and everybody in it was shot. That's life. But the worst part of life, in many ways, is the chemical warfare. We don't call it defoliation now. We call it defumigation. But same thing. It's lethal substances sprayed from the skies, I suppose mostly contractors by now. And you see, and the effects are striking. First of all, it destroys the crops, not just opium, destroys everything. It poisons the land. There are people, being a coffee farmer is not easy these days, but there are people who've managed to kind of develop a niche market for organic, high-quality organic coffee that they can sell in Germany and so on. That's finished because the land's poisoned. You can't grow anything more. People with horrible scars all over their arms, children dying, the kind of things you see in Vietnam. And that's today. Just in the last couple of years, according to the Attorney General's office, about 140,000 people have been killed by the paramilitaries and the military, and there are other things too. But this is going on before our eyes. We regard it as our right to carry out, pardon? Sorry, should have said that earlier. We regard it as our right, it's not questioned, to carry out, still louder? I don't know if I can manage anything louder. We regard it as our right, we don't question it, to carry out chemical warfare in another country because they're producing something that our government doesn't like. Actually, the president of Bolivia asked a pertinent question. How would we feel if they were to carry out chemical warfare in North Carolina and Kentucky to destroy a crop that's far more lethal than cocaine? In fact, just take a look at the death tolls. Well, it's our right, it's not their right. This goes on before our eyes, and part of the reason is a failure to pay attention to similar atrocities in the past. And this is not the end by any means. Just yesterday I got a letter from an ex-Marine who fought in Iraq, and he was, I've known him for some years, he was part of the military force that invaded Fallujah in November 2004. That was a horrible massacre. It's kind of like Srebrenica, actually, except worse in many respects. One of the respects in which it's worse is the kind of weaponry they used. There have been studies now by epidemiologists and other scientists in the Fallujah area, and it turns out that the level of radiation, persistent radiation in that area, is actually higher than Hiroshima. The letter he sent me yesterday, this young man, after he got out, has been devoting his life to trying to compensate for those horrors. This was a scientific article that just appeared studying hair samples of people there, and the hair samples have extremely high evidence of radiation poisoning. And it again has the usual effects, the same kind you described, and it could be permanent. And unless we face up to these things, it's going to continue. There's no barrier to it except internally to the United States. Nobody else can do anything about it. These are two examples, and you can add others. And American veterans suffer from it too. Also, the effects of heavy metals, probably depleted uranium, others that's has plenty of effects on American veterans who are exposed, but of course, as always, the major lethal effects are on the victims. And as Fred said, this can go on indefinitely, even when the war is technically over, and even more so when we carry out similar operations elsewhere, as we're doing right now.